The storm came without warning, a churning mass of slate clouds that swallowed the horizon within minutes. One moment, the sea was calm under a pale sun. The next, the sky split open and dumped its fury upon us. I had boarded the Orbis Meridian, a research vessel contracted for a month-long oceanic survey mission, believing it would be a routine expedition, tedious, perhaps, but safe. It wasn't. I was not the only one caught unprepared. The crew scrambled to batten down equipment, secure hatches, and send distress signals. I remember the captain barking orders through static-ridden radios, trying to coordinate an evacuation procedure no one had rehearsed in earnest. When the lightning struck the upper mast and plunged the deck into flickering, electrical chaos, I knew the worst was yet to come. The lifeboat tone of several, though I can no longer recall how many made it to water, was lowered hastily as the ship listed violently to starboard. I was pushed half-shoved into the vessel along with 6 others. 2 crewmen, a young couple who clung to one another silently, a stern-faced older woman in a company jacket, and a wiry, sunburned man with twitchy eyes and a muttered prayer on his lips. There was no time for introductions. As soon as we hit the water, the waves took us. The ship's silhouette disappeared behind a curtain of salt and storm. There was no explosion, no dramatic sinking, just absence. One moment it was there, towering above us, and the next it was gone, consumed by wind and foam. We were left adrift, 7 souls in a fiberglass shell barely 15 feet long, at the mercy of a violent sea. For hours, we rode the swells in silence, soaked and freezing. The emergency canopy flapped uselessly in the wind until the older woman secured it with a broken oar handle. Water pooled around our feet, despite the drainage ports, and our supply, such as they were, remained sealed in a bolted compartment we hadn't yet dared open. It was not fear of rationing, but a strange sense that to acknowledge our situation would make it real. By dusk, the storm had passed, leaving behind a bruised sky and seas that still heaved with memory. No ships in sight, no birds, no sound but the sloshing of water and the occasional moan of the lifeboat's strained hull. The sun set in streaks of copper and ash, casting our haggard faces into stark relief. That was when someone finally spoke. "We should check the supplies," said the older woman, her voice low but authoritative. Her name, I would later learn, was Dr. Miriam Voss, a logistics coordinator for the expedition. She moved with the confidence of someone used to solving problems. With help from the wiry man, his name was Ellis, we pried open the compartment. Inside, a handheld radio, 2 emergency rations, a flare gun with 3 cartridges, 4 bottles of desalination solution, and a compact first aid kit. Enough to survive 3, maybe 4 days if we rationed carefully. We had no idea we would need to stretch it to 13. That night, sleep was impossible. The couple, Rachel and Mark, I would later learn, huddled together beneath a thermal blanket. The crewmen, Ortega and Ewan, kept silent watch, their uniforms still damp and clinging. I sat near the edge, watching the black water, wondering if the ship had managed to get off a signal, if anyone would come looking. I told myself they would, that someone had seen the Mayday, that we just needed to wait. But as the hours passed, and the sky deepened into an endless dome of stars, doubt crept in. There is a particular stillness in the open sea, a silence that swallows hope. It presses in on you, makes you small. I felt it then, for the first time, a fear not of drowning or dying, but of being forgotten. Lost, not just physically, but erased. A drifting dot among infinite others. No one spoke after that. The cold did not relent, and the lifeboat rocked gently under the distant stare of the moon. We were still alive, yes, but already, something was beginning to change in us. We were no longer passengers on a ship. We were survivors. By morning, the sky had turned a dull, indifferent blue, as if the heavens themselves were tired of watching. The sea had calmed but not stilled, the lifeboat bobbing gently over an endless quilt of gray-green swells. It was the kind of quiet that shouldn't exist after a disaster too clean, too empty. The storm had taken its fury with it, leaving behind a sea that seemed sterile, erasing any trace of the ship or of the lives it had swallowed. We sat in silence, each of us lost in our own fog of disbelief. I remember the light that morning, thin and sickly, washing our faces in a colorless sheen. No birds flew overhead. No planes carved trails across the sky. It was as if we had drifted into some pocket of the world where time did not reach. The lifeboat creaked softly as it shifted. Mark stirred first, rubbing sleep from his eyes with one hand while the other stayed curled around Rachel. She had not moved at all. Her face was pale, almost waxy, and her lips were cracked from wind and salt. I wondered if she had slept, or simply closed her eyes to escape. Dr. Voss took inventory again, her movements precise, methodical. She reminded me of a librarian organizing the end of the world orderly, calm, above panic. But I caught the tremor in her fingers when she thought no one was watching. Ellis muttered something under his breath, eyes scanning the horizon like he expected it to crack open and deliver salvation. Ortega and Ewan remained inscrutable, sitting upright, their eyes bloodshot but alert. Professionals to the end, or simply frozen in the routines that had kept them alive on ships before. I thought about food, not because I was hungry. We had eaten nothing, but because the idea of it grounded me. I pictured the mess hall of the Orbis Meridian, the stainless steel trays, the smell of reheated stew, the scrape of utensils on plastic. It seemed so distant now, a dream of metal and warmth and light. Out here, the only sound was water slapping softly against the hull, a metronome counting something none of us wanted to name. Around midday, Ortega used a knife from the first aid kit to cut one of the ration bars into exact segments. He didn't speak, just passed the pieces around with deliberate care. It tasted like dust and syrup-compressed calories with the texture of cork. But no one complained. We ate like monks receiving communion, not because we were grateful, but because to reject it would be to reject hope. That afternoon, we began drifting further south, though we had no instruments to confirm it. The sun shifted, the air grew thicker, and the currents carried us like discarded cloth. No one suggested using the flare. It was too soon. Or perhaps we were too ashamed to admit how quickly we might need it. Rachel spoke then, her voice barely a whisper. She asked if anyone knew what time it was. No one answered. There was no time anymore, only light and dark, hunger and thirst. The question itself felt like an intrusion, a reminder of clocks and calendars that had no bearing here. Mark tried to comfort her, murmuring something into her hair. She didn't respond. By the second night, the air had turned colder again. The lifeboat's thin canopy offered little shelter, and condensation beaded on the inside like a warning. Ellis began to laugh softly at something only he could see. Dr. Voss told him to rest. He snapped that he'd rest when someone came. His voice cracked on the last word, and then he turned his back to us, pulling the thermal blanket over his shoulders. That was when I noticed something new in absence, not a presence, the absence of direction. We weren't heading somewhere. We were just moving, floating. The ocean gave no sign of rescue. No driftwood, no oil slicks, no birds. The world had shrunk to 15 feet by 6, with 7 people orbiting each other like moons circling a dying planet. Sleep that night came in fits. I closed my eyes and dreamed I was underwater, not drowning but floating, watching bubbles rise like silver coins. When I awoke, I wasn't sure I had ever really slept. I only knew that my legs were stiff, my skin ached from salt, and my mouth was dry even after sipping the desalinated water. Morning came again, but it brought no change. The sun rose reluctantly behind a veil of haze. The ocean around us shimmered without warmth, and the horizon remained cruelly empty. It occurred to me then that this was not just survival, it was waiting, not for help, but for the moment someone would break. By the third day, the smell of salt had fused with our skin, turning each of us into something half-human, half-sea-worn artifact. Our clothes clung to us like a second skin, stiff with brine and sweat, our bodies sore from the unyielding fiberglass floor. There was no room to stretch, no space for privacy. Every breath, every shift of weight, echoed through the cramped hull like a whisper through a tomb. We spoke less now. Conversations had narrowed to necessities show much water was left. Who would take the next watch, whether a distant cloud meant rain or heat? Even Rachel, who had once asked about time, now sat in a numb silence, her arms wrapped around her knees, gaze fixed on the horizon as if willing it to blink first. Mark tended to her, rubbing warmth into her arms, murmuring quiet encouragements that no longer reached her ears. The sea had its own rhythm, and it pulled us into it. Mornings arrived not with promise, but with the fatigue of having survived another night, of knowing we'd have to do it again. The sun rose without warmth, casting long shadows inside the canopy, making ghosts of us all. Hunger became an ache that lived just below the skin. The ration bar had shrunk to near nothing, doled out in pinches. We were down to a third of the desalination fluid. The flare gun sat untouched in its slot, as if it were a myth we could only invoke once, and not yet. Ortega and UN continued to rotate watch shifts like they were still on duty aboard a living ship. I wondered if they knew what else to be. UN had a quiet stillness about him when he wasn't watching the sea. He sat motionless, eyes closed, like a monk suspended in meditation. Ortega was different. He paced when he could, shifting restlessly, his hands constantly moving, fixing loose knots, checking supplies, adjusting the tension on the oars though we had nowhere to row to. He said little, but his tension infected us all. It was that afternoon when the first argument broke out. Ellis, whose nerves had begun fraying from the moment we hit the water, snapped over the water ration. Dr. Voss had proposed reducing our daily intake. Logical, calculated, rational. But logic frays at the edges when the throat burns and the tongue swells. Ellis stood, fists clenched, shouting that she had no authority, that we weren't lab rats to be measured and weighed. The canopy shook with the force of his voice. Ortega stepped between them before it escalated. No blows were thrown, but something shifted after that. A crack in the group that never fully sealed. That night, the wind picked up again, not a storm, but a cold gust that sliced through fabric and skin alike. The sea hissed, restless and wild in the dark. I stayed awake longer than usual, watching the shimmer of starlight on the water, listening to the creak of the hull, and the quiet breathing of the others. It was then I realized how profoundly alone we were. Not just lost but forgotten. No planes, no ships, not even debris. The ocean had swallowed the Orbis Meridian clean. The next morning, we found something floating nearby. A crate sealed, intact. It must have broken free from the ship's cargo hold during the storm. Ortega and Yuen paddled us closer, using their hands and a salvaged board. The crate bobbed lazily in the water, sun-bleached and barnacle-flecked. Hope clung to us like the salt in our lashes, but when they pried it open, it was filled with mechanical part sensors, metal rods, tubing. Nothing useful, nothing edible, just weight. Still, something changed in us after that. Not hope, Heno. Hope had become a fragile thing but motion. We began scanning the water more, peering at every flicker and shadow. Looking didn't cost us anything. It gave our minds something to cling to. We began speaking again. In short, clipped exchanges. Someone suggested fishing, though we had no lines or bait. Someone else mentioned the flare again, and was met with silence. That evening, a pod of dolphins appeared, 5 or 6 of them, sleek and silver, cutting through the waves just beyond our reach. Rachel gasped when she saw them, the first sound she'd made in hours that wasn't a whisper. For a moment, we all leaned toward them, watching their smooth, effortless dance. It was beautiful. It was cruel. They vanished as quickly as they came. That night, I dreamed of the ship again. But this time, it was upside down beneath the waves, its lights still glowing faintly, and figures moving slowly behind its portaleslo, as if underwater, watching me from below. When I woke, the sky was red with dawn, and Ellis was missing. At first, no one spoke. It was as if we feared saying his name would summon the worst. Ellis was gone, or no splash, no scream, no hint of struggle. One moment he had been curled at the back of the lifeboat, murmuring to himself in the dark, and the next, he wasn't. The space where he had lain was still warm when I reached over, my hand brushing damp fabric and the edge of his rolled-up jacket. We checked the water, craning over the edge, calling his name into the morning haze, but the ocean gave nothing back, only gentle waves lapping against the hull, indifferent and slow. There are silences that come with grief, and then there are silences that come with fear. This was the second kind. We didn't speak of it, didn't suggest what might have happened, whether he had fallen overboard in a daze, or jumped, or slipped while searching for something in the dark. But I saw the suspicion in their eyes, flickering like embers just beneath the surface. We all wondered the same thing. Had we been too tired to hear it? Too cold to care? Too distant to stop it? Rachel cried softly beside Mark, her body shaking in small, involuntary spasms. Mark held her tighter, whispering nothing that could help. "Doctor?" Voss kept her eyes closed, her lips pressed into a thin, rigid line. Ewan reached into the supply compartment, his hands moving slowly, methodically, as he took stock once more. Only Ortega spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "Nothing's been touched," he muttered. "No signs of struggle. He just disappeared." We all nodded as if it made sense, but nothing made sense anymore. Later that day, Ortega and Ewan began tying strips of torn cloth to the oar handles, fashioning makeshift flags. They said it was to increase our visibility just in case a plane flew overhead. No one mentioned that no plane had passed us in days. Still, it gave us something to do, a task to numb the hours. I held one of the cloth strips in my lap, turning it over again and again, until the edges frayed beneath my fingers. It smelled of Ellis, of sun and salt, and a man who used to laugh to himself when no one was looking. The air had grown thicker, the clouds above casting dull shadows across the sea. Occasionally a glimmer of sunlight pierced through, just enough to burn. The ocean was no longer silent. It groaned and sighed beneath us like something tired of pretending. That afternoon, a single gull passed overhead. We stared at it in reverent silence, as if it might decide to land and tell us which direction led to salvation. But it flew on, its cry echoing faintly across the water. That night, no one slept. We kept vigil in shifts, each pair watching the others, as if afraid someone else might vanish the same way. Mark's eyes had sunk deeper into his face. He no longer tried to comfort Rachel. He just kept her close, like a tether against drifting. "Doctor," Voss remained stoic, but I caught her watching the water, her fingers drumming against her leg, as if counting something. A pulse, a thought, a prayer. Around midnight, I heard her murmur, "He didn't cry out." The words slipped from her lips as if uninvited. By morning, we were 6, and yet the boat felt smaller. The fourth day brought heat like a punishment. The sun rose brutal and bright, searing the canopy, turning our small prison into a furnace. The water rations were down to 1/3 of a bottle per person. We sipped them with trembling hands, feeling the liquid vanish from our mouths before we could swallow. The salt from the sea clung to our skin, drew out what little moisture remained in our bodies. Our lips cracked open. Our eyes burned. Rachel began murmuring to herself that afternoon. Her gaze never left the horizon, but her words drifted back into the boat like broken threads of thought. "He was here. He was right here. They said the sea takes what it's owed." Mark tried to hush her, but she swatted him away, her voice rising in sharp, clipped gasps. Ortega had to lean forward, press a firm hand to her shoulder, not in anger, but in desperation. "No one's being taken," he said. "We're going to get through this." But even he didn't sound convinced. That evening, clouds rolled in from the west, thick and swollen with the promise of rain. We tilted the canopy to catch it, but it passed us by, spitting only a few drops before sweeping into the distance. I tasted one on my tongue, sharp and sweet, like something remembered from childhood. But it was gone too fast to matter. The flare gun sat untouched. Dr. Voss had insisted we wait until the 7th day halfway. She argued that if we used it too early, we risked squandering the one tool we had. But now, I could see even she was questioning that choice. The gun looked heavier every time someone glanced at it. That night, Mark shook me awake. His face was pale, his breath shallow. "She's gone," he whispered. I sat up. The space beside him was empty. Rachel's thermal blanket lay where she had been, folded neatly. No one had seen her leave. Mark didn't cry when he told us. His voice was hollow, as if something had been scooped out of him and thrown into the sea with her. We checked every inch of the lifeboat, though there was nowhere for her to have gone but overboard. Her blanket lay where she had folded it. Her shoes were tucked neatly beneath it. The only thing missing was Rachel herself. No one said it aloud, but we all understood. Whatever had taken, Ellis had now taken her. Whether it was despair, madness, or something far quieter, more patient, we couldn't say. But it didn't feel accidental. It didn't feel like coincidence. Rachel had slipped away not in panic, but in surrender. Mark sat there for a long time after that, shoulders hunched, his fingers digging into the seams of the lifeboat, as if he could anchor himself there, as if his grip on the plastic edge might keep him from vanishing too. No one approached him. Even Ortega and Yuenso, often the steady ones, gave him space, their gazes lingering just long enough to acknowledge the new weight in the boat. We were 5 now. Dr. Voss was the one who finally moved. She checked the supplies again, her eyes scanning the compartment like it might suddenly sprout hope. I watched her lips move as she counted beneath her breath. Then she sat back, rested her hands in her lap, and stared out at the endless expanse of water. There was no lecture, no suggestion. The math had already been done. That day was quiet. We had grown used to silence, but this was different, heavier. There was no wind to push us. The sea had turned still, glassy, reflective. Our movements created soft ripples, but beyond that, the ocean was dead calm. The kind of stillness that feels like holding your breath for too long. The kind of stillness that listens. Mark didn't speak again until just before dusk. He pointed toward the horizon and said, "There was something in the water last night, before she disappeared." We all turned to look, but there was nothing, just the faint shimmer of the sun dying against the sea. "I thought it was a trick of the dark," he continued, "but I heard her whispering, not to herself, to something." Dr. Voss shook her head gently. "Grief can sound like a voice. I've known that much." But Mark's eyes didn't blink. It answered. That night, I volunteered for watch. I wasn't sure if it was bravery or insomnia. I just didn't want to lie still and wait for the lifeboat to take another of us. The others drifted into fitful sleep, save for Mark, who sat upright with his knees drawn to his chest, blinking slowly, as if refusing to close his eyes meant keeping Rachel close for just one more hour. The moon rose silver and clean. The sea mirrored it perfectly. For a time, I believed we had been placed not on water, but suspended between two skies, one above, one below. The stars blinked in silence, uncaring, and then I saw it. A shape. Far off at first, too dark to define. It drifted just beyond the edge of our field of vision, circling like a shark without the fin. Smooth, patient, deliberate. I froze. My breath shallowed. I wasn't sure if I was seeing it or imagining it. But it was there, moving against the current, gliding, pulsing faintly with its own light, like a distant lantern just beneath the surface. It made no sound, left no wake, and then, slowly, it sank beneath the waves, disappearing into darkness. I didn't wake the others. I told myself it was exhaustion, a trick of the moonlight, but deep in my chest I knew it was real. Not a monster, not exactly, but not something that belonged to the known parts of the world either. Morning brought clouds and a stifling heat that stuck to our skin like wet paper. Yuen had taken the emergency mirror and begun signaling at the horizon in slow arcs. It was useless, but it gave him something to do. Ortega fashioned a fishing line from thread, pulled from the seams of the thermal blankets, and a sliver of metal from the flare casing. It was hopeless, but he dropped it into the water anyway. We were all pretending now. Mark didn't move at all. He sat, eyes blank, whispering Rachel's name so softly it sounded like the sea itself. Dr. Voss finally broke the silence just before dusk. She reached for the flare gun. "I'm using it," she said. "This is day 5. If we wait any longer, we'll run out of reasons." No one stopped her. Ortega just looked away. Yuen gave a single nod. I held my breath. She fired the flare high into the sky. It arced beautifully, a crimson comet against the darkening clouds, before falling into the water with a distant hiss. We watched for hours afterward, but the horizon remained empty. No planes, no lights, just the colorless hush of night. We were still 5, but I had seen something in the water, and I no longer believed we were truly alone. We didn't speak much the day after the flare. It was as though the gunshot had echoed into something sacred and broken it. The sky had answered with silence, the sea with indifference, and now we were left adrift with the heavy knowledge that no one was coming. Not because they hadn't seen us, but because perhaps we had drifted too far, slipped too deep into some forgotten pocket of the world. The heat returned with a vengeance, pressing down on us like a hand. The canopy sagged with condensation by morning, and by midday, our skin felt burned from the inside out. There was no shelter, no shade, just the eternal brightness of the sun and the glinting, mocking sparkle of salt water we couldn't drink. I licked my lips constantly, knowing it only made them worse. Every sip of desalinated fluid became a ritual, each drop counted, divided, cherished, resented. Mark hadn't moved in almost a full day. He sat in a kind of statue stillness that felt wrong, like the grief had taken root inside his spine. His hands remained folded, head bowed, eyes half closed but never asleep. I thought, once, that I saw his lips moving, but when I leaned closer, there was only the faintest exhale, as though he were breathing through someone else's dream. Dr. Voss had grown quiet too. She no longer kept track of supplies. I'd once watched her calculate everything with fierce precision. Now she stared past the waves, her fingers brushing the edge of the lifeboat in slow, steady circles. I recognized the rhythm. Not counting, rocking, calming, a self-made lullaby. Yuen was the only one still fighting. He repaired Ortega's makeshift fishing line every time it broke, his fingers surprisingly nimble, his expression unwavering. I'd begun to wonder if he was doing it for the catch, or simply because doing anything at all kept the terror at bay. That was the thing they never teach you about survival. It's not just about the body. It's about giving the mind something to do so it doesn't eat itself. It was during one of these long silences, when the boat floated weightlessly in the dead calm, that Ortega finally spoke again. His voice was hoarse, like it hadn't been used in years. "There's something in the water," he said. I met his eyes. He wasn't asking. He wasn't wondering. He was stating a fact. "I've seen it too," I admitted. "At night." "What is it?" "I don't know." He didn't press, just nodded once. That was all it took. A single shared moment of truth, and suddenly, the world beneath us felt infinitely larger. That night, I stayed awake again. Not by choice, by fear. The air felt wrong. Too warm. Too still. The ocean, which had rocked us for days with its restless lullaby, was suddenly flat and quiet, like it was holding its breath. The others slept in stuttering shifts. Mark still hadn't spoken. Yuen lay curled with one arm over his face. Dr. Voss had fallen into a strange, shallow sleep, her body twitching now and then, as though dreaming through fever. And I watched the water. Just after midnight, I saw it again. Closer this time. A silhouette below the surface, long, slow, and impossibly fluid. It didn't ripple the surface, didn't disturb the lifeboat. It moved as though the ocean parted for it, as though it didn't swim through water, but slid through it like thought through memory. And for the first time, I heard it. Not words, not language, but a resonance. A hum not in the air, but in my chest. like something strumming the space around my heart, tuning me. I couldn't move. I didn't want to. It passed beneath us, not fast, not slow, just deliberate. Then it was gone, swallowed into the ink of the sea. The next morning, Ortega didn't wake. He wasn't missing. He hadn't disappeared. He was there, curled against the side of the lifeboat, eyes closed, skin pale with a strange stillness. I remember how peaceful he looked. Not scared, not pained, just still. I touched his wrist. No pulse. Yuen tried to revive him, pressing his palms against Ortega's chest, whispering sharp commands to a body that didn't listen. But it was no use. He was gone. We were four. We didn't speak that day. Yuen sat beside Ortega's body, not crying, not praying, just sitting. Dr. Voss clutched her knees and stared out toward the horizon, her face dry, her eyes glassy. Mark finally moved. He shifted away from us all and turned his back to the boat's center, staring at the water and whispering something only the ocean could hear. As the sun dipped low, I looked down into the waves, and I swear I saw eyes. Not glowing, not monstrous, just watching, waiting. The seventh night passed without wind, without sound, without even the whisper of waves against the lifeboat's hull. The sea had become a mirror, too still to be real, as if the surface had turned to glass and we were suspended in a photograph taken long ago. Every movement felt like a disruption, a transgression. Even breathing too deeply felt like it might shatter something fragile. I lay awake beneath the thin canopy, listening to the uneven rhythms of the others, Yuen's shallow breaths, Dr. Voss murmuring broken syllables in her sleep, Mark, silent still, unmoving in his usual spot. My own mind had started to unravel. Thoughts didn't follow each other logically anymore. I'd begin remembering my father's voice, then find myself thinking of the sound the flare had made when it hissed into the sea. I imagined conversations I never had, meals I hadn't eaten. At one point, I was sure I smelled fresh bread, warm and yeasty, like the galley back on the Orbis Meridian when the cook was in a good mood. But it was only the heat of the plastic under my cheek and the sourness of my own breath tricking me. Dr. Voss awoke with a start sometime around dawn. She bolted upright, her eyes wide, scanning the lifeboat like she didn't recognize it. "Where are the lights?" she asked. "Where did they go?" I sat up slowly, unsure whether to answer. She looked at me, panicked. "They were circling us, all night. I saw them under the boat. They were watching us from underneath like windows, like a hallway down there." Her voice cracked. She looked toward the water, then pressed her palms against her eyes as if trying to push the vision out of her skull. "It was glowing," she whispered. "Blue, soft, like hospital lights." No one said anything. Not because we didn't believe her, but because part of us did. That day passed like a fever. Yuen spoke for the first time in nearly a day, asking for the exact date. I told him it was the 8th. He looked unconvinced. He said it felt longer, that he wasn't sure the sun was setting in the right place anymore. I checked the sky, the arc of the light. It looked off, lower, dimmer. Or maybe I'd just forgotten how the sun was supposed to look. Mark finally spoke again near dusk. "They come when it's quiet," he said, his voice brittle and unused. "That's how they choose." No one asked who he meant. That night, something changed. The temperature dropped suddenly, without warning, like someone had opened a door into winter. The air turned damp and sharp. I could see my own breath. The sea didn't change, but the boat did. It felt heavier, slower, like something was pressing against it from underneath. Yuen sat upright, staring over the edge. I wanted to pull him back, to say something, but my voice had turned to sand. Then he leaned forward. Not far, not fast, just far enough that his fingers brushed the water and he froze. He didn't scream, he didn't gasp. He simply froze in place, like something had turned him to stone. I lunged toward him, grabbed his arm, and pulled him back into the boat. He fell limp in my grasp, unconscious but breathing. His fingertips were cold as ice. When I rolled up his sleeve, the veins in his forearm glowed faintly blue, as if something had passed through him. Dr. Voss covered her mouth with one hand, her eyes wide and wet with terror. Mark, on the other side, just smiled. "I told you," he whispered. "They speak through the water." Yuen didn't wake for hours. When he finally stirred, he didn't recognize us. Not right away. He looked around the boat as if seeing it for the first time. Then he touched his own chest, gently, like checking whether he was still whole. "What did you see?" I asked him. His lips trembled. "They're not cruel," he said. "Just curious." That was worse than anything else. The 9th morning came slowly, cloaked in a gray mist that clung to the water and veiled the horizon. We were surrounded by fog on all sides. It pressed in close, choking off the sun. The air felt thick, as if soaked in sleep. Nothing moved. No breeze. No current. No birds. No sound except the occasional pop of tension from the lifeboat's frame. I tried the radio again, even though I knew it was useless. Just static. Just silence. Mark stood for the first time in days. His limbs shook, but he held himself tall. "I'm going in," he said calmly. Dr. Voss moved to stop him, but he stepped back, gently, not hostile. "She's down there," he said. "I can feel her, calling." Yuen looked away, and I couldn't move. Mark slipped over the edge like he was stepping into warm bathwater. There was no splash. The surface barely rippled. We didn't see him again. After Mark disappeared, the fog never lifted. It wrapped around us like gauze soaked in cold sweat, turning day into a dull smear of colorless light and night into something formless and unending. The sun no longer rose or fell, it just hovered somewhere unseen, dimmed to a flickering suggestion behind the mist. I had lost track of time completely. We all had. The days no longer made sense, not when nothing moved and everything stayed the same. We were three: Dr. Voss, Yuen, and me. Yuen had stopped speaking again. Since the night he touched the water, something in him had changed. He seemed to understand more than he could say, or perhaps more than he dared to. He sat in silence for hours at a time, eyes closed, lips parted slightly like he was listening to a distant melody. He moved slowly now, deliberately, as if mimicking the rhythm of the sea itself. When I asked if he was all right, he nodded, but his gaze remained fixed somewhere beyond the lifeboat, as if he were waiting for instructions. Dr. Voss had grown gaunt. Her movements were sharp and mechanical, her eyes hollowed by exhaustion and something else dread, perhaps. She no longer spoke of logic or rescue. Her hands trembled even when she was still. Sometimes she'd murmur to herself, running through medical procedures aloud like mantras. Assess airway, check responsiveness, apply pressure. But there were no patients left. Only us. And me, I was unraveling. Sleep brought no rest. My dreams had become long, slow drifts through dark corridors filled with water. I floated past doors with numbers I couldn't remember and windows with faces I almost recognized. Sometimes I would see Mark standing at the bottom of the ocean floor, staring up at me, his mouth moving silently, his eyes wide with something that wasn't fear. Sometimes Rachel was beside him, reaching upward, her hands thin as bone, her hair rising like seaweed in invisible currents. Once I woke up with salt water in my mouth. I hadn't fallen in. I checked, but my lips were wet, my throat tasted of brine. Yuen said nothing when I asked if he'd seen anything, just stared at the horizon, humming softly. On the 10th day, I began to hear the hum again, not faint. Not in my chest this time, but in the air. A low, resonant frequency, like a cello string drawn out across the ocean itself. Dr. Voss heard it too. Her eyes met mine across the boat and she whispered, "It's real." That night, we saw the lights. They came from below, faint at first, like distant stars caught under the sea, then brighter, closer, a pale, glowing lattice of moving shapes, no clear form, no identifiable structure, just light moving through water in slow, perfect symmetry. Blue and silver, with occasional pulses of amber like a heartbeat. They circled the boat in silence. The water around us rippled outward in perfect rings. The sea was no longer deep black, it had turned translucent, like thick glass lit from underneath. I leaned over the edge and saw them. Figures. Not human, not fish. Just shapes, impossible and beautiful, suspended in the blue like a choir waiting to be heard. Dr. Voss began to weep, not out of fear, but awe. "They've been watching," she whispered. "Studying us." "What do they want?" I asked. But she shook her head. "Not want, not like us. They observe, they echo." Ewan reached toward the water, this time without hesitation. He didn't touch it, just held his hand inches above the surface. One of the lights pulsed directly below him, then drifted up in response, mirroring the motion, like a greeting. For a moment, I felt everything slow down. I could feel my heartbeat sinking with the pulse of light beneath the boat. I felt calm. The fog pulled back, just slightly, revealing a sky dusted with faint stars. It was the first time I had seen them in days. Real stars, not illusions in the water. They shimmered above the ocean like they had been waiting for this moment. I remember thinking, this is it. We're being shown something. Not saved, not rescued, but offered something else. Understanding. Maybe. Then, all at once, the lights began to sink. One by one, they descended slowly into the black below, their glow fading with each meter, until the sea returned to darkness. No sound, no splash, just absence. The fog returned soon after. Dr. Voss didn't sleep that night. She sat upright with her knees tucked to her chest, whispering things I couldn't hear. At one point, I heard her say, "We're not made for their silence." The next morning, I woke to find her gone. Not missing, gone. Her shoes were still there, her coat folded neatly beside Ewan. No ripples, no splash, no scream. We were too, and beneath us, I swear the sea was breathing. After Dr. Voss vanished, I didn't speak for a long time. There was no point. The words had no shape anymore. They would have vanished in the fog, like everything else. Ewan and I simply existed beside each other, two figures in the shell of a lifeboat that no longer felt like a vessel. It felt like a cradle or a grave. The line between the two had become increasingly unclear. We never found any sign of her. Just her coat and the last place she had been sitting, still slightly warm. Ewan didn't react. He didn't even turn to look. He just sat staring at the surface of the water, like he'd been waiting for it. And perhaps he had. Perhaps we all had. From the moment we climbed into this floating coffin, maybe the sea was simply taking back what it had loaned. On the 11th day, something changed again. Not with the sea, but within me. I started to feel as though I had already drowned. Not in water, but in memory. I couldn't recall what my room looked like. My mother's voice, the scent of cold air before a storm. My mind wandered back to fragments of childhood, then swerved violently into present sensations, the sting of salt crust on my skin, the steady ache in my stomach, the splitting burn behind my eyes. My thoughts no longer obeyed me. They circled the drain of my awareness like vultures picking at the edges. Ewan had stopped blinking. He sat upright for hours, unmoving, pupils dilated, his breath shallow but rhythmic. Once I reached out to touch his shoulder, and he flinched like he'd been burned. But he didn't speak. He just held up a finger, not to me, but to the air end, pointed toward the water. They came again that night. I didn't hear them at first. I felt them. A soft thrumming, like the bones in my arms were vibrating. The air shifted, thickened, and then the water began to glow. Not brightly, just enough to reveal outlines, structures. The suggestion of form beneath the waves, arches, spirals, lattices of slow-moving light. A city, maybe, or something older. It wasn't built. It had grown. Shapes moved within it, long, fluid, impossible shapes. Not limbs, not fins, something in between. They didn't shimmer or flash. They simply were. Moving with purpose, slow and precise, like dancers underwater. I watched, breathless, as one shape drew closer to the surface, so close I could see it clearly. It had no face, no eyes, just a membrane, translucent and veined with light, pulsing faintly, but it turned toward me. I felt it not physically, but mentally, like my thoughts weren't my own anymore, like something else was listening through me. Not invading, just observing. Behind me, Ewan stood. He moved slowly, with reverence, like someone entering a cathedral. He didn't look at me. He stepped to the edge of the boat, his bare feet touching the lip, and he reached down. The figure in the water responded. It rose upward, the light around it intensifying, and then Ewan lowered himself into the sea. Not a fall, not a jump, a descent, as if gravity worked differently for him. There was no splash. The water opened, accepted him, and closed above his head like silk. I knelt there, staring at the place where he had vanished. Beneath the surface, the lights faded again. The figures drifted downward. The city dimmed, and I was alone. Utterly, wholly alone. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe hours. Maybe seconds. Time didn't pass the same way anymore. The fog thickened again, and I stopped trying to see through it. I wasn't even hungry anymore. My stomach had turned to dust. My throat felt hollow. The sounds in my head had replaced the sounds outside. I thought I heard them whispering, not in words, in suggestion, in rhythm, not in English, not in any language that used mouths. I tried to speak back. I don't remember what I said, just sounds rising and falling, shaped by instinct. I think I wept, but I'm not sure if any tears came. There wasn't enough left in me. The 12th day was all sky. The fog finally lifted that morning. Not completely, but enough that I could see the faint outline of the horizon again. It didn't look real. It looked painted, soft, and too perfect. I blinked hard, trying to trust what I saw, but there it was. Sky, water, light. I laughed. I think. It might have been a sob. The ocean was flat and calm. The sun reflected off the surface, a dull gleam like hammered brass. The lifeboat creaked softly with each gentle sway, and I realized the sea was no longer breathing. It had gone still again. Watching, I stared into the water, and I saw my own reflection staring back. But it blinked before I did. I didn't look away. The reflection held my gaze like it had a question only I could answer. The eyes in the water were mine, but not entirely. The face was shaped like mine, but it felt older, weathered not by time, but by knowing. A version of myself hollowed by revelation. When I blinked again, it was gone. Only the water remained, flat and unmoved, stretching endlessly in every direction. I waited. Not for rescue. That hope had long since drained out of me, replaced with something quieter. Something that didn't need answers anymore. I wasn't afraid. That was the strangest part. Even in the stillness, even with the last echoes of human company long vanished, I felt no panic, no dread, just a deep, abiding sense of having passed through something vast and invisible. I wasn't at the center of it. I never had been. I was only a witness. The 13th day began without ceremony. A pink glow brushed the edge of the world, and the sky, for the first time in what felt like years, turned blue, pale and brittle like frost, but unmistakably real. I blinked up at it, my vision swimming. My lips were cracked, my muscles useless, but my mind somehow was clear. Empty, perhaps, but clear. The silence of the sea was no longer oppressive. It was comforting now. A hush, a kind of reverence. I could no longer feel the hunger or the ache. My senses had softened. Every detail, the creak of the boat, the warmth of the rising sun, felt like a goodbye. And then, in the far distance, I saw a shape. Small, too small to believe at first. A line. A mast? I blinked, unsure if I'd finally slipped into hallucination. but it came closer. A white triangle. Sails. A boat. Real. It took hours. The sun had already climbed halfway into the sky before the vessel finally reached me. The crew's voices called out sharp, human voices that pierced the air like knives. Someone jumped into the water. Strong arms wrapped around me, lifted me up. My body didn't resist. It just floated. A voice said my name. I didn't remember telling them. I didn't remember speaking at all. I awoke in a hospital bed with salt still clinging to my skin. They told me I'd been adrift 13 days, that they'd found me alone, barely alive, dehydrated, malnourished, but intact. They didn't ask about the others. Not at first. Just my name. Where I was from. What I remembered. I answered their questions softly, nodding when appropriate, letting them take blood, press their cold instruments against my ribs, shine lights into my eyes. They said I was lucky. That most don't last that long. They said nothing of lights beneath the water, nothing of humming voices, nothing of those who had vanished one by one, claimed not by storm or starvation, but by something watching patiently below the surface. I didn't tell them. I knew they wouldn't understand, and I didn't want to give it away. Some things you carry alone. When they discharged me, the nurse pressed a hand to my arm and smiled. "You're a miracle," she said. I smiled back, but inside, I was hollow, not empty, just changed. For weeks after, I would find myself staring at puddles, at reflections in windows, in mirrors, at the faint glint of light caught in polished metal, watching, just in case the water chose to look back again. I never saw the eyes, but I often felt them. I sometimes dream of the city beneath the waves, the lattice of glowing corridors, the shapes moving just out of view. In the dreams, I'm not afraid. I'm not even myself. I'm part of it. My arms move like theirs. My thoughts drift without words. And when I look up, I see a lifeboat above me, gently swaying, and I understand what they were waiting for. They weren't studying us. They were remembering us, echoing us, and maybe, when they pulled the others under, they weren't taking, they were offering, showing, giving them a glimpse of something older than language, a place beyond time, a silence that doesn't suffocate but understands. I survived, but sometimes I wonder if I left something behind, a version of me that never made it back, that still floats in that small boat, watching the sea breathe, whispering the names of the lost into the foam. Sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, when the world is still and the wind carries the scent of salt through my open window, I swear I hear it again, that low, impossible hum, and I find myself listening, not in fear, but in recognition, because once, for 13 days, I wasn't alone. And maybe, I never really was.